Hello there. My name is Jibu Elias, and I will be talking about the role of culture in AI ethics, especially from an Eastern cultural perspective. Before I begin, I want to thank the Global AI Ethics Consortium for this great opportunity. Hope you will enjoy this lecture. Before we begin, let me introduce myself. I am an AI ethicist and researcher from India. I'm currently the head of research and content for India AI, the Government of India initiative on AI. I'm also a member of OECD network of experts called One AI and one of the founding members of Springer's AI and Ethics Journal. So currently my work focuses on building an unified AI ecosystem in India, as well as working towards closing digital divide that has arisen as as a result of technologies such as AI. Through this course, I will be walking you through the following points. First, we will begin with the importance of AI ethics in current scenario, the role culture plays in determining AI ethics. Thirdly, why we need diversity and inclusion in AI ethics discourse. And 4 and 5 are what we can learn from Eastern cultural perspective in AI ethics and Eastern philosophical approach to AI ethics as well. So why AI ethics is important, or what is the purpose of an AI ethicist? So there is this definition which I feel is the most accurate way to describe why we need AI ethics. So the purpose of AI ethics is twofold. The first one is to deal with ethical issues that arise from AI systems as objects, as we have seen with the discrimination, the unethical biases, and other issues arise as AI. More and more we use AI tools. And second is to deal with the moral questions raised by AI systems as subjects. So what kind of rights an AI will have if we ever create a artificial consciousness? So these kind of the moral and ethical questions falls under the second purpose of an AI ethicist. So now coming to this examples of some unethical or let's say controversial AI ethics system, AI systems that has created some bad press in the last few years. So by going through these examples, it will help us understand why we need a strong AI ethic framework and what will happen if we didn't prioritize it. So a few years back, Amazon launched a recruitment tool. It's a secret AI-based recruitment algorithm. The idea was to find the best of the best engineers for hiring. But unfortunately, whether it's due to the bias in the data, inherent data, the algorithm started to show a lot of bias towards male white candidates as opposed to other people. So soon after they're realizing that, after it became a big news story, they shelved this algorithm, and we don't know right now if they are using any forms of algorithms for recruiting. Second is the Compass, which was a AI tool used by in US for parole allocation. So the Compass calculated the risk of giving parole. What is the chances of a particular prisoner repeating the crime if he's out on parole. The sad thing was this algorithm was extremely biased against people of color. For example, if you the investigation done by ProPublica a few years ago, they found that a white male who has a serious crime of assault with a weapon, those kind of people were given a very low score very low score when it comes to the tendency to repeat these crimes. At the same time, a black man who has done something maybe as low as in possession of marijuana was given a very high score of 8 to 9% by this algorithm, which in turns affect a judge's ability to decide who should be given parole. The third here is a issue that happened very recently in the UK. Due to the pandemic, the UK government decided to use an algorithm to help grade the A-level students. Now, what this ended up doing was students from very bad neighborhood schools, poor neighborhood schools, even though they scored high marks in their exams, previous exams,
This supplement score provided by the algorithm ended up making their scores comparatively lower. At the same time, students from a affluent neighborhood, they or the schools which has a history of performing better tend to score a higher marks as a result of this algorithm, because how the algorithm calculated the previous year performance as a one of the parameter for allocating this grade. So this was very controversial, and this is one classic case of implementing AI without much thinking of its consequences. And in the end, I think they had to go back on it and went ahead with teacher provided assessment. Now, the last one is very interesting. It's a case that, as you can see in the screenshot here, it's a case that happened in Facebook. So, a Palestinian man once posted a good morning message on Facebook. He was standing near a bulldozer and he posted, "Yes, be whom." I'm not very good with the language, so which actually literally translates to good morning. But however, Facebook AI system back then, actually it was built by Microsoft's Bing translation in 2016, instead translated a word into hurt them or attack them in English. So this ended up in arresting of this gentleman, and a lot of trouble he has to go through, even though later on he was released after understanding the whole fiasco about it. So this is why we need strong AI ethics framework. This is why we need strong AI ethics legislations across the world. Because if there is no strong AI ethics rules and guidelines, then these kind of examples and use cases are bound to repeat much frequently in the future. Now, coming to the problem of AI ethics itself, the AI ethics discourse currently faces a big challenge, and that is the dominance of Western perspective and lack of diversity. So, AI in a global context right now is biased toward perspectives held in US and limited by lack of research, especially outside the US and Western Europe. West dominate this AI ethics landscape right now, which is not a ideal way to go ahead. If we are talking about creating global frameworks, global guidelines, ethical guidelines, and a similar legislation. A study run by the team from ETH Zurich under Anna Jobin, they examined around 1,000 codes pertaining to AI ethical principles. And according to the researchers, the most worrying fact about this report, their study was that they are essentially published by a small number of people in a small number of countries. So the ETH study concluded that West accounts for this 63% of these codes relating to ethics in AI. So a further in-depth analysis by the researchers, I mean, they went through 84 documents, and it shows that 23.8% of this came from USA, and 16.7 came from UK, and rest coming from EU, constituting the 63%. Now, worryingly, the other part was that the African and South American countries were not represented independently in any of these principles or guidelines or codes that were published, which is a very worrying trend. So this over-representation of West or lack of global equality in the treatment of AI ethics shows that the most economically advanced countries are shaping the debate by neglecting local knowledge, cultural pluralism, and global fairness, which are very important. So this is a quote from a paper by Haggerty and Rubino, and it is a very serious concern that AI ethics is being perceived as ethics from a European standpoint of view, or an American standpoint of view, or as we call the Western standpoint of view, when a significant part of the world lives in the Asia, the Africa, the South America, and where there is a different culture, there is different norms of ethics, and there is a different approach to AI and AI tools. So that's why we need, if we are to deploy these tools across the globe, the people who will be impacted by the deployment of AI tools of let's say the global south, or from countries like India or other Asian countries, then it is important that they also have a say in how the AI ethics or the frameworks must be shaped. And that means more participation from these people, more representation, inclusion, and more and bringing more diversity into the global AI ethics discourse. Now, why culture is critical in AI ethics? So the study by Haggerty and Rubino, they reviewed around 800 academic journal and articles, and their finding is that, which is very important, that AI is highly likely to have markedly different social impacts, depending on cultural settings. So we will get into that, how three different cultures look at AI in the later part of this lecture. But this is very important, how our perception of AI and how we use these tools are a lot tied to our culture. Likewise, the perceptions and understanding of AI are likely to be profoundly shaped by local culture and social context. For example, if you remember, the impact of culture on technology is not something new. From time to time, we have seen how Western science fiction has influenced technology and innovation. For example, when Martin Cooper, when he invented the first mobile phone, which was with the Motorola, he publicly stated that the whole invention was inspired by these communicators carried out by Captain Kirk and the crew in Star Trek series. Similarly, we have seen the whole how the idea of AI, especially in a Western perspective, is often of fear, especially coming to super intelligence, of fear and worrying as a result of movies such as Terminator, Matrix, and so on. So the way culture shapes our perspectives is very important when we go forward with AI ethics. What is culture? How do we define culture? So it is a collective programming of the mind that distinguishes the members of one group or category of people from the others. So I think this is a very good definition by Hofstede on what culture is. So culture can be said as a set of common values, norms, beliefs, or ideas shared by members of the same group. Something that's not written down like a constitution or a legislation, but it's a collective value that a group of people possess. You can say it in that way. Now, how culture influence ethics is very important, and it's a reality that culture and ethics are very tied up, and it lot depends on each other. So, a person's cultural background can influence the way they look at the world, or how they feel what is right and what is wrong. So that's why we say, many of these things are subjective, because these things depends. For example, a person's standard on beauty, it varies according to the culture. A person's standard on how you interact in a society varies according to the culture. For example, there is this behavior that is in the corporate world in China, that you give a lot of gift to the people. Now, it is a very accepted kind of behavior in China. But at the same time, if you are talking about the same thing in a Western scenario, it's often seen as bribing. Similarly, the idea of privacy, the idea of individual privacy is very paramount when it comes to West, especially when it comes to America. But at the same time, if you come to countries like India, societies like India or China, where we live in joint family, you will be sharing a room with your cousin. You will be your aunts will be knowing what you are doing. Your uncles will be knowing what you are doing. And in a scenario, if you go and say, "Hey, I want privacy. I want to keep this information. These are my private information, and this is my private space," then you will be seen as a bad seed. You will be seen as a selfish individual who is not cooperating with the collective norm or the culture, as we said before. So, how culture influence ethics? Due to various cultural background, Individuals can differ greatly with regard to what is ethically appropriate. As we said, in some cases, gifting is incorporated, is accepted in some areas, in some places it's not. So it depends on the culture. So the inherited bias in AI, which is something we have seen with the Combus algorithm or the Amazon recruiting algorithm, and many other cases such as credit scoring algorithms as well. This inherited bias is likely due to some social and cultural embedded unfair stereotypes that had been fed directly or indirectly into this algorithm. So they say this the historical data that is generated as a result of our biases, our discrimination that have been happening across, say, decades or centuries, are now reflecting in these algorithms. So it is a cultural problem than a technological problem, and the solution for these problems is also lies from a cultural standpoint of view, rather than adding more technology to solve these things. And finally, culture influences how a person views the world, and can determine how a person may view different ethical scenarios. For example, there is this one particular thing I do with people across the world. I ask the famous trolley problem to people from across different geographies and different cultures, and the answer you get for the trolley problem is very different from culture to culture. For example, if you don't know what trolley problem is, you have a trolley coming out of control, and there are two tracks going left and right, and there is a lever in between. And on left track, there is five people trapped in the left track, and on the right track, one person is trapped on the track. Now it is going towards the left track by default, and you, being a bystander, has this option to go and pull the lever, which will then make the trolley go to the right track, killing the one person. So the question is, will you pull the lever and kill the one person to save the lives of five? So this question, if I ask to people from West, especially from the North American continent, mostly the answer is they don't do anything, right? They don't want to pull the lever and become a murderer. They will rather let the five people die in an accident. But if you ask this question to someone from Asia, whether from Southeast Asia or East Asia, then the answer is different. They will say definitely they will pull the lever, because the life of five will always exceed the life of one. So in a collective society in Asia, which always has this one answer, while as opposed to a individualistic society that we have seen in the West. That's how culture influences how a person view the world or how they perceive an ethical scenario. Now, what is ethics? We've been speaking about ethics and its relation to culture. So I have picked up three of the definitions that I feel is more appropriate and more in line with AI ethics. So ethics deals with human behavior. Ethics can be thought of as a framework covering philosophy, moral problems, and moral judgments. So in this context, ethics is a set of norms and values which have been improved to praise or criticize the behavior of individuals living in the same community, which is very close to what culture is. And laws to regulate social life, even when it comes to the location of an event, may be insufficient to assess the ethical. Especially increased interactions of nations shows a situation which can be considered as ethical in a society, can be considered unethical in another. So these are pretty much summarizing some of the points I discussed before. So ethics and culture are very closely tied. So the cultural norms and values affect both perceived ethical situation, alternative result, and possibilities of these results. So according to the paper by Harity and Rubino, ethics and culture must be considered together as an interlocking strand of social DNA, such as the twin helices we see in the DNA structure. To understand any culture, we must first understand its values. To understand the values, we must understand its cultural context as well. So because AI and ethics are joined, we cannot study ethics solely as a philosophical abstraction, but ethics must be studied in everyday cultural context if it is to be fully understood. So in other words, it's not enough to know the rules of the games right now for AI ethics, but we must also understand how people play this game. So ethical perception has a crucial role on ethical decision making process because evaluation of the individual a situation has ethics depends on how ethics depends on how an individual evaluate a situation. Now let's go to East. So I am going to look into three Eastern cultures here: the Chinese, the Japanese, and the South Korean culture. Now, the reason why I chose these three cultures as opposed to something like India is that in the West, these three cultures are combinedly stereotyped as Asians. Now, it will be interesting to go through these three cultures and see how different they are when it comes to their cultural and ethical perception towards something like artificial intelligence and robotics and technology in general. So Chinese, Japanese, and South Korean perspectives on AI and robotics. This can be considered in two different ways, right? It can be seen as tools or as partners when it comes to this AI ethics debate. Now, let's imagine a spectrum. On the one end, you have a culture where you see AI as a tool, and the other end you see in a culture where you see AI as a partner. So in this spectrum stands these three culture, and let's see how each of these culture and where they stand in the spectrum. Let's start with South Korea. Now, South Korea stands on the extreme tool side of the spectrum. So AI is placed in the tool range due to the establishment of a, let's say, clear human over machine hierarchy in the society. So in South Korea, humans are of the highest priority, and robots are expected to support and further enhance its position of dominance. So AI and robot, as I said, is to support and further enhance its position of dominance. And South Korea also demonstrates a clear preference for functional AI applications and robots, especially focusing on human empowerment in the areas of, let's say, something like public service, healthcare, education, social care, disaster relief, and security. Now, going a little bit deeper into the South Korean culture, let's look at what are the principles they have, whether it's social or from a policy perspective. So in 2007, the South Korea Institute of Robot Industry Advancement actually published a robot ethics charter. Now, this was updated, revised in 2016, and it provides four unique ethics guidelines. So the first guideline being, it places considerable responsibility on users. It expect users to be informed and self-regulated when it comes to using AI and robots. It places responsibility for preemptively assessing AI and robots for any potential negative impact it can have. So that has to be done by the provider. Thirdly, it holds the developer responsible to ensure that any socially discriminatory characteristic is eliminated in the design, and to ensure that it is accessible to disadvantaged and vulnerable groups. So developer is held accountable for these cases. And finally, it calls to refrain from developing AI and robots with antisocial characteristics, and to minimize social resistance and disorder against universal use of AI and robots. So this is what we can understand from a South Korean perspective on AI. From an ethics and cultural standpoint of view. So they see AI and robots primarily as tools and not as a companion, not as a social element. Now, going to China, we will see a little bit change here. Now, China stands, let's say, on the middle of the spectrum, a little bit closer to the Korea. And according to China, China holds a top-down view of AI and robots, as as tools for progress. Also, they see AI as a important part of their asymmetric warfare strategy as well. Now, as demonstrated in government and official corporate and policies, the ethical component of this approach is only now being started to materialize. And if you look deeper, you can understand that the China's AI ethics approach is in pretty much alignment with what the global guidelines are being developed. Largely viewing AI and robots as tools. So, and finally, China also presents a strong interest in recent years in imbuing AI and robots with partner-like capabilities to help them realize their full positive potential. Now, this is very apparent in recent academic thought, local practices, and popular culture, as we say. So, China, as we know, doesn't have an policy framework on AI ethics. But if you look at the China's big tech companies who has been driving their AI innovation and adoption, you will see some of these guidelines or principles that has been put forward. So one important piece here is Baidu's Robin Lee Yangyong's proposal in 2018, where he submitted a proposal calling on the government to speed up AI ethics research, citing the impending transition of AI from a simple tool to a stakeholder in many areas. So Lee also introduced Baidu's four AI ethics principles, which are safety and controllability, equal access, human development, and freedom. Now, another side of this is Tencent. Tencent's Ponima Huateng submitted a proposal similarly calling for ethical AI regulation. So this stance is in line with the some of the work by Tencent Research Institute, and their framework also focuses on four principles which are available, reliability, comprehensiveness, and controllable. So this is what China's, let's say, a cultural or like an ethical framework they have when it comes to AI. Now, Japan is a total different game altogether. So Japan stands on the extreme other end of the spectrum, where AI is seen more as a partner or part of the society. So we have seen this very cute little robots designed by Honda and other Japanese firms. Some of them helping with senior care, and some of them helping children, students, acting as a part of family. Now, Japan is exceptionally has a strong mix of pro-human AI robot partnership, whether it's an academic thought or local practice or popular culture. So, like I said, Japan sits in this partner range of the spectrum. And while Japanese policy approach to AI is now moving a lot to the tool range of the spectrum, let's say closer to China and to an extent to South Korea, the extent of Japan's societal vision for coexistence and co-evolution with AI and robot is totally distinct. So this is the only cultural, only country that came out and say, we need to figure out a way to coexist and co-evolve with robots. And another distinct feature in Japan is that it's a very strong techno-animistic tradition, right, which has likely inspired the development of its favorite partnership attitude. So this entails a more intertwined and complex analysis of Japan's perspective, which requires a lot of work. So this is what Japan's cultural perspective on AI ethics in a nutshell. Now let's look at what the policy work or framework they have in place. So Japan's fifth science and technology basic plan back in 2016, it seeks to integrate AI and robots into all aspects of society to create an environment where humans, AI, and robots can coexist and co-evolve, like I mentioned before. Now, this plan again introduces the idea of Society 5.0, which is a vision of an AI and robot-enabled, convenient, and diverse society that responds to all human needs. And this is the interesting part, and can even anticipate and respond to many of these human needs before they emerge. So that's what the idea of Society 5.0 is. So this vision also further expanded by this Cabinet Office Council's social principles of human-centric AI. So the one aspect of this document is its view of AI and robotics as widespread social tools that necessitate the redesigning of Japan's social system and even its individual character. So to conclude, to date, Japanese government is the or most probably the only one going to such lengths to socially accommodate and integrate AI and robots as a part of its society's foundation. Now, it is very interesting to note that three of these cultures, the Korean, the Japanese, and the Chinese, which are often categorized together as Asians in the West, has three distinct approach when it comes to AI, and especially from an ethics and cultural standpoint of view. Now, going to Eastern philosophical perspective, which is itself requires much more in-depth studies. So if you look at Eastern philosophical, I'm talking from a, let's say, South Asian perspective or an Indian perspective. So there are 11 major schools of philosophy in India. You have this Vedic philosophy that goes through Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Samkhya, Yoga, Mimamsa, and Vedanta. Then you have the school of Shramnik philosophy, which consists of Jain, Buddhist, Ajivika, Ajnana, and Charvaka schools of thoughts. Now, out of all this, the most important one in terms of the widespread use across the continent, as well as the number of people who is following, is Buddhist philosophy. And here we will examine how the Buddhist philosophical perspective influences AI ethics, or what is its stand on AI. So there is this amazing work done by Thai researcher Swaraj Hanglo Doram. He has written actually a whole book on Buddhist perspective of AI. So here's what he says: the implication of Buddhist teaching for AI is that any ethical use of AI must strive to decrease pain and suffering. In other words, a facial recognition technology should be used only if it can be shown to reduce suffering or promote well-being. Moreover, the goal should be to reduce suffering for everyone, not just those who directly interact with AI. So the Buddhism proposes a way of thinking about ethics based on the assumptions that all sentient beings want to avoid pain. Thus, Buddha teaches that an action is good if it leads to freedom from suffering. So that's why a Buddhist-inspired AI ethics would also understand that living by this principle requires a lot of self-cultivation, which also means that whoever, whether it's developers or the makers who are involved with this AI, also should continuously train themselves to get closer to the goal of totally eliminating suffering. So the Buddhist perspective of AI pretty much stands with many of this AI for social good or AI for all perspective, which is adopted by countries like India and many other organizations across the world. At the same time, it also explores some much complicated thoughts when it comes to AI ethics, such as if we are to create, let's say, a sentient being, does it have the rights of a human, or how we will treat when something like an AGI or artificial consciousness comes into place. So this is what Buddhism says about that. So according to Buddhism, robot and AI can be persons. Because the condition for being a person are more relaxed than in any other religions. AI can be a person because in general it exhibit human-like traits here. So that's the Buddhist perspective on AI. And now let's look at why these cultural perspectives and these thoughts are very important when it comes to building a global AI discourse on ethics. So what we have seen so far is, despite the regular need to create a framework on AI ethics and the need for diversity, the current norms and guidelines on AI ethics is mostly one-sided and dominated by a Western approach to it. Now, as by going through these four examples, the three cultures and one philosophy, I hope you will be able to understand that how different and how diverse the approach towards AI is across the globe. And if you go to Africa, if you consider such as Ubuntu philosophy, it will get much and much diverse. So it is important and important that we make the AI ethics discourse more diverse and more participatory, more representative. At the same time, we must ensure that there are people who are living in the parts of the world who might not have access, might not have the skill set to become the part of this AI revolution, to create products or create tools. For example, there are countries, there are remote island countries across the world which doesn't even have many good internet connections. For example, we say data is the new oil. But according to a 2018 World Economic Forum white paper, an American household generates one data point every 6 seconds, but 96% of the country of Mozambique doesn't even have access to internet. So it is important that that as AI ethicists, we must think about how we will ensure that, let's say, a person from the culture of Mozambique, their social values, their ethical norms, and their perspective on technology gets representation, and they are consulted and considered when it comes to creating a global AI ethics discourse. So thank you so much for listening to this lecture. I'm sure it was helpful for you. And if you have any follow-up questions, you can reach out to me on social media channels such as Twitter and LinkedIn. And once again, thanks to the Global AI Ethics Consortium for this opportunity.